Hi everyone, I'm here today to talk about a collaboration between ecologists and industry to create better environmental outcomes. This stems from work over the past 5 years that was achieved without direction or support from the government or regulatory bodies. So wind energy kills bats, but it doesn't have to. So renewable energy is seen as a key player in our efforts to address climate change. However, wind turbines are not environmentally neutral. Birds, especially raptor species and microbats, are particularly susceptible to collisions with turbines. Raptor collisions have gained much attention over the past 20 years, and mitigation techniques such as automated turbine shutdowns when eagles and large birds are detected in the area have been adopted and are reducing collisions. However, for bats, the collision risk is much higher, yet much less has been done to mitigate this risk. Bats are not an iconic species that are considered by many. Their cryptic and nocturnal nature means they have all but been forgotten, and their importance in our ecological landscape cannot be understated. So bat impacts at wind turbines around the globe are being reported in very high numbers. In the USA and Canada, this number was estimated to be around 1 million bats per year back in 2015. In Victoria, best estimates based on carcasses found at operating turbines put this at around 6 to 11 bats per year for every turbine built. More recently, some sites in Victoria are reporting over 20 bats per turbine per year. For other states, this figure is unknown, as monitoring the impact of wind farms on wildlife is not as common as it is here in Victoria. So in Victoria, we have around 1,200 operating turbines, and that will increase over the next 5 years to over 2,000 turbines, meaning that somewhere between 12,000 and 40,000 bats will die through collisions with Victorian turbines every year. And even more concerning is that half of all the impacts will be to a single species, the white-striped free-tailed bat, a critical insect consumer and essential for maintaining healthy ecosystem balance. So bats consume around half of their body weight in insects every year. So for 20,000 bats, that equates to around 500 kilograms of insects, which is 20 million flies or 200 million mosquitoes. The contribution they make to the US agricultural industry is valued at around $23 billion annually, and their importance to Australian farmers should not be underestimated. So there has been a lot of research overseas about why bats are colliding with turbines, and the jury is still out. We don't really know why, but what we do know, and what Oliver Burr and colleagues in Germany were able to demonstrate clearly, is when collisions happen. So for microbats, wind speed is a good predictor of activity, as shown in the graph from Oliver's paper. It is also a predictor of turbine activity, as low wind speeds below 2 or 3 meters per second, bat activity is highest and turbines are stationary. And as wind speed increases, bat activity decreases until around 6 to 8 meters per second, where bats are no longer flying. Unsurprisingly, as wind speed increases, turbines commence operation, usually at around 2 to 3 meters per second. So we have a window, here it is, where impacts can happen. So curtailment, which is what we've done, is simply closing that window by increasing the cut-in speed at which turbines commence spinning, and therefore reducing the risk of collision with bats. So in this study, we commenced a voluntary study with Pacific Hydro at their Cape Nelson North Wind facility in Portland, following the discovery of the endangered bent-wing bat during routine mortality monitoring. So without government guidance, Pacific Hydro embarked on a program to reduce their impact to the southern bent-wing bat, as well as all bats within the area, and accepted my recommendation to trial curtailment. So just a bit of background, Cape Nelson North Wind Farm is located southwest of Portland on the western side of Victoria. The wind farm consists of 11 turbines with a rotor hub height of 80 metres a rotor diameter of 92.5 metres, a swept area of 6,700 metres, and a maximum rotor speed of 15 revolutions per minute. So just to explain that and put that in perspective, that's around 1.7 acres of rotating blade travelling up to 280 kilometres per hour at the tips that needs to be avoided by flying animals to prevent collision. So we know that birds and bats are killed at wind farms. So at every wind farm in Victoria, and increasingly in other states as well, bird and bat monitoring programs are put in place to determine if the impact of these deaths is above or below a threshold of acceptance. This involves routine mortality searches at some or all of the turbines, depending on the size of the wind farm. And these surveys are most often monthly, but sometimes more regularly, such as fortnightly or weekly. Typically, a pulse survey is undertaken 2 to 3 days after the original survey to reduce the influence of scavengers removing carcasses. Detection performance is done twice per year, and dog teams in Victoria typically perform above 90% detection. In addition, trials are conducted to see how long a carcass can persist before being removed by scavengers so that it's available to be found. Following this, the data collected is analysed using a Monte Carlo simulation, and estimates of overall wind farm mortality are derived. Where impacts are above thresholds, the typical response by regulatory bodies has been for more surveys to be conducted, to be sure, extending the mortality monitoring, but not addressing the mortality impacts themselves. And this is where our study sought to change that. So we commenced a before and after study design in the first year, turbines were monitored twice weekly using trained detection dogs with a proven detection probability of over 95% in this instance. Concurrently, ANABAT recorders measured the activity of bats to ensure that each of the monitoring years was comparable. And January through to April was chosen as the months of the highest impact, as this accounted for over 80% of all the bat impacts that had been found during the previous few years of routine monitoring. All of the turbines were monitored, and the following summer, turbines were curtailed to 4.5 metres per second, and carcass searches and bat activity monitoring commenced with the same parameters. The length of monitoring was not quite balanced due to some logistical issues getting started in the first year. However, this was taken into consideration during the analysis. So what did we find? Well, we found that activity was consistent between years, if not slightly higher in the second year, meaning that any changes to mortality counts could not be attributed to a reduction in bat activity. And whilst we acknowledge that acoustic monitoring is not a direct measure of activity, it was the best method that we had to provide a baseline to allow us to compare the 2 years. And unsurprisingly, and in line with all the work done overseas, bat mortality declined during curtailment of the turbines. In fact, mortality was reduced by 54%, and notably, for both the white-striped free-tail, bat carcass numbers declined by 2/3. So the unit of measure we used for comparison was the number of bats found per survey across all 11 turbines. So in the first year, on average, 1 bat was found twice a week for the 4 months every time we surveyed. And with curtailment, this was reduced to 1 bat per week, so every second time we surveyed, meaning that for some surveys, we found no bat carcasses in the second year. So closing the window of risk will reduce bat deaths. And at every site in Australia, we can do this. We can reduce bat deaths. And this study clearly demonstrated that curtailment is a solution that will work. One of the elements which surprised the operator of the wind farm was that lost revenue was much smaller than anticipated. Wind turbines create revenue for the operator when the wind is blowing and when demand for energy is high. Curtailing turbines overnight at low wind speeds during the warm months of summer does not represent a major proportion of annual revenue. And in fact, this was less than 0.1%. For this reason, and for the passionate work of Kim Derriman, head of the environment team within Pacific Hydro, we were able to secure a voluntary curtailment commitment as an ongoing strategy to reduce bat deaths for the life of this wind farm. And this is great for this wind farm, but remembering this is just 11 turbines out of more than 1,200 that are already operating. And time is critical. We can't wait for another bent wing bat to trigger action. Bats are dying at unsustainable rates, and the solutions to prevent that are out there. So I'm just going to finish up by calling on all the regulators to step up and do their job. The evidence is there. We know it works in Australia. We cannot continue this mass execution of native species without intervention. I have worked with industry and they are ready, but they are waiting for someone to lead the way, and that needs to be the regulators. I want to thank my co-authors, Elizabeth, Stevie, Mark, Alex, Matthew, my believers, Tracy, Fiona and Ian, the dogs that collected the data, Nari, Rubble and Jimmy, and a big thank you to Kim Derriman from Pacific Hydro for believing in me and doing the right thing and working within his own company to make this happen. And if only every company had a Kim, then I wouldn't need to work so hard to protect the bats. Thank you.